Welcome. I'm Sebastian Mahfood, and you're listening to WCAT Radio, the on-air wing of En Route Books and Media, bringing you the dulcet sounds of Catholic wisdom.
In the interest of total transparency, since that's the big word nowadays, I should mention that I'm a total product of Catholic schools from kindergarten forward. The first time I encountered non-Catholic education was in the seminary. The venerable doctor tried to steal my thunder before you all arrived. He asked how many have gone to Catholic schools. So let's do a show of hands. How many went to Catholic elementary school? Secondary? Okay. I've got the material that I want to deal with, and then if we have time, I think we can have an interesting discussion as well. So it's actually both a privilege and a pleasure for me to lead you in a reflection on the importance of Catholic schools precisely in a secularized society. And although I'm generally not an American flag waver, and I'm always very willing to admit the unfortunate contributions that some Americans have made to the devolution of Western civilization, this time I'm going to use the American scene as a point of reference or departure for several reasons. First, the assault on Catholicism hitting Europe now with a vengeance is something American Catholics had to confront in many ways 2 centuries ago, albeit with some critical differences. Second, the American response, especially through the establishment of an independent, self-sustaining Catholic school system, can and should be programmatic for Europe. Indeed, it was a unique experiment in church history, a response not to secularization as such, but to virulent anti-Catholicism. And third, the secularization effort in Europe and elsewhere does indeed have a predominantly anti-Catholic thrust, predicated on the principle that going for the biggest and most highly organized religious body will in effect bring down the rest as well. So a brief overview of some American political history. The white Anglo-Saxon Protestant historical narrative would have us believe that American history began with the 13 original English colonies. Of course, that's not the case, because the Spanish involvement actually predates the English by more than a century. It was interesting, some years ago, I happened to be doing a Catholic school teachers workshop in the Diocese of St. Augustine in Florida. And it was Catholic Schools Week, and the pastor invited me to preach at the school mass for the children. And in the homily, I talked about their privilege of being Catholic school students, and I asked if they knew where the first Catholic school in America was. And every hand in the church was up. And I thought I'd be interested to get this answer. And the little guy, 4th grader, which for us is about 10, 11 years old, he said, St. Augustine, 1506. The Capuchin Fathers opened the first Catholic school on the continent, followed a few years later by the Ursuline nuns for girls. So the history really goes very, very far in advance. But for the sake of conventionality, let's use the WASP version as our starting point. The majority of the early colonists came to the so-called New World, at least from a European perspective, for reasons of either faith or fortune. That is, to escape religious persecution, although they were pretty good at providing it once they got to our country, or to make it big, if what looked to be an open market from a financial and commercial perspective. Their hopes were so high that they even had recourse to biblical language, suggesting that the New World was a new promised land. Now, leaving aside their overall treatment of the indigenous peoples, which, by the way, was far worse at the hands of English Protestants than of Spanish Catholics, we find a deeply religious people, even if relatively intolerant of what some today would call diversity. There's high irony here, to be sure, because, as I said, so many of them had left the mother country precisely due to religious intolerance. And while many could allow for some religious diversity, it was limited to what we would now classify as mainstream Protestantism. No such toleration could even be imagined for Catholics, who in most of the original 13 colonies could not vote or hold public office, and in some places being a priest itself was a capital crime. And while we Catholics were the principal victims of intolerance, It's worth citing Cardinal Newman's insight that a coming age of infidelity, as he called it, would make the traditional Catholic-Protestant battle seem inconsequential. With independence from England and the establishment of the Constitution of the new nation, various safeguards were instituted to guarantee freedom of conscience, more often noted in the breach than in the observance, especially, again, for Catholics. The First Amendment to the Constitution mandates, quote, Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof. By the time Thomas Jefferson referred to that legal doctrine as the separation of church and state in 1802, the nervousness of the Holy See becomes quite understandable, especially because she viewed it through the prism of the European experience of hostile regimes like the French Revolution. The reaction of the Holy See, while not irrational, was only partially correct. So yes, there was, and yes, still is, a deeply, deeply anti-Catholic bias in the American ethos. However, the equally deep religiosity of the people and the freedoms that flowed to the Church eventually enabled us Catholics to outstrip every other religious grouping in terms of education, professional achievement, and economic standing by the last quarter of the 20th century. I'm the grandson of 4 immigrants, and I have 2 doctorates. And it's precisely, by the way, due to the Catholic school system. Here let me distinguish between secularity and secularization. There's a good secularity, or laicity, we actually don't even have the word in the lexicon, which the Church has come to recognize, especially as she viewed the American situation from the vantage point of the 20th century. Jesuit Father John Courtney Murray helped the Church Universal come to this awareness through his groundbreaking book, We Hold These Truths, in 1960, and through his contributions to the Decree on Religious Liberty at Vatican II, Dignitatis Humanae. Father Murray stressed that freedom for religion, not freedom from religion, was the goal of the U.S. Constitution and Bill of Rights. Secularization, on the other hand, is a conscious effort to marginalize religion, religious influence, and religiously motivated citizens. Peter Berkowitz uses the French situation as a point of contrast. He writes, the doctrine of laïcité, inscribed in Article 1 of the French Constitution, and proclaims France a secular republic, separates church and state differently than in America. For many French, laïcité, roughly translated as national secularism, has acquired a militant meaning, according to which government must confine religion to the private sphere. Interestingly, in a rather significant, at least apparent shift of long-standing national position, President Macron recently suggested that France needed the input of the Church and encouraged the bishops of France to engage in the national conversation, although one may wonder just how much and what kind of input he really desires. Let me anticipate one of my ultimate conclusions by submitting at this moment that vigorous secularization demands vigorous evangelization for the sake of the Church's future and for the sake of society's future. Pro mundi salute, we say in the Liturgy of the Hours, for the salvation of the world. Now, I believe that divine providence saw to it that 2 sets of circumstances coalesced in the U.S. situation, giving the Church the possibility of not only surviving, but even thriving. The first was the constitutional reality, and given the essential commitment to fairness endemic to the American people, there was good reason to hope that religious freedom would eventually be extended, yes, even to Catholics. The second fact concerns what we might term the fundamental religiosity of Americans, noted by the Frenchman Alexis de Tocqueville in 1835. He writes in Democracy in America, the religious aspect was the first thing that struck my attention. And that same observation comes from the pen of the great English convert G.K. Chesterton, who called the U.S. the nation with the soul of a church. That basic religiosity is still operative, in spite of many secularizing forces exercised by a vocal, if tiny, minority. The liberal media elite consistently attempt to drive public opinion in a leftward direction. But numerous studies have demonstrated that those people are very far removed from the average citizen. Indeed, their positions on matters like the existence of God, the importance of church membership and attendance, abortion, pornography, and issues of sexuality are polar opposites to those of the vast majority of the population. Another example, no U.S. president could ever be elected who didn't give at least lip service to religion. Or again, visitors, especially from Europe, are always amazed at the friendliness of the populace toward clergy and religious on our streets, even in such a rough and tough environment as New York City. I get greeted on the street in Manhattan by Wall Street executives, cops, hookers, and drug addicts alike. Being greeted as a priest in public is a commonplace in the United States. Frankly, it's a rarity in Rome. All that said, it's important to point out that a decade ago, for the first time in the U.S. history, the Catholic Church experienced hostile incursions from a president during the Obama years, highlighted in 2009 report of the Catholic League for Religious and Civil Rights. This point was seemingly not grasped by many Europeans, including not a few very short-sighted Vatican officials. As you undoubtedly know by now, these assaults caused numerous religious organizations and dioceses to sue the Obama administration to vindicate our rights. And thankfully, those suits bore fruit. And thankfully, yet again, the current attitude toward the church is vastly improved in the Trump regime. So, what kind of secularity would be beneficial to the church and to society? One which promotes pluralism, a concept espoused by most modern democracies. The very expression, though, is fraught with problems because divergent interpretations of pluralism are possible. From a religious perspective, a good secularism would mean not mere toleration of religious influences, but encouragement of them. Indeed, the very nature of a free society demands that all voices be raised and that all be respectfully heard, including religious voices. Now, a few minutes ago, I said that the process of secularization required a determined effort of evangelization. Bishop Arthur Kennedy, retired auxiliary of Boston and a great scholar in his own right, is fond of asserting that the primary engine of evangelization is the Catholic school. Many others have come to a similar conclusion, so that we've witnessed a renewed interest in Catholic education as enrollments have stabilized for the most part and have even increased in many dioceses, especially in high-growth areas. Schools are on the rebound in terms of reclaiming a truly Catholic identity, highlighted in surveys done by various sociologists, which show that graduates of post-Vatican II Catholic schools continue to be markedly different from their public school counterparts. Public in our system means government, especially in regard to Sunday Mass attendance, attitudes on abortion, willingness to consider a priestly or religious vocation, and generosity to the local parish, both in service and donations. The vast majority of our priestly vocations continue to come from Catholic schools. Although only about 25% of Catholic boys go to a Catholic high school, roughly 90% of the ordinandi every year are the graduates of Catholic schools. At yet another level, the success of Catholic schools in the U.S. plays out with phenomenal regularity in the academic realm. Professor John Coleman of the University of Chicago documents an impressive performance record for Catholic high school students, which indicates that they outstrip not only students in the state schools, and amazingly so, though, students also from private elite academies. The reason for the success, according to Coleman, is because of the religious and moral values, and because of the coordination between the home and the school. And these two aspects are especially significant in explaining the incredible achievements of youngsters in inner-city Catholic schools, most of whom themselves are not Catholic. So, pluralism and democracy need a voice, yes, and therefore a training ground. As I've already argued, genuine pluralism demands a plurality of voices, which in turn needs a source for the development of those voices. Not surprisingly, every godless revolution has outlawed Catholic schools as its first offensive in attacks on the church, knowing that a church without schools is a church without a future. Indeed, at the very peak of a very strong anti-Catholic movement in the States, the state of Oregon actually attempted to outlaw Catholic schools, resulting in the 1925 landmark judicial decision vindicating the rights of parents in general and of Catholics in particular. Interestingly, it's the only U.S. Supreme Court decision ever quoted in a papal encyclical, namely Pius XI's Divini Elius Magistri, which is on Catholic education. In some ways, traditionally Catholic countries in Europe have been living in a fool's paradise, thinking that the religion taught in state schools is providing what's needed to raise up a generation of countercultural agents. Indeed, in many places, like Italy, the religion classes in the state schools are generally a farce, with the priest teaching in them treated with disrespect, and the classes themselves often becoming a platform for anti-religious propaganda. In other places, if the classes have not devolved into that mode, one can be sure that such comfortable arrangements will be attacked and whittled away at until they just disappear. I should mention that not a few Catholics in the United States, myself included, have eyed with envy the funding system of Catholic schools in the UK. Observing current trends, however, I suspect that the funding may soon be coming at too high a price. After all, we all know he who pays the piper calls the tune. And that may well lead to a lessening of Catholic control and identity, as already happened in massive amounts in Canada and Australia. Therefore, it's essential that hierarchy and laity alike make serious preparations for the establishment of an independent Catholic school whose goal should be twofold. Positively, conveying the beauty and glories embodied in the Catholic intellectual tradition, and negatively, providing an honest, comprehensive, compelling critique of the contemporary culture, really anti-culture. Now that you've heard some of the historical background to the Catholic educational system in the U.S., along with its accomplishments, I hope it can serve as a kind of object lesson for what I believe a similar effort can be for other countries. Theodore Sizer has concluded that, quote, as a matter of public policy, education should move toward institutional pluralism. Very well. This opinion would obviously hold that a multiplicity of educational forms would more accurately reflect the multiplicity of publics forming a nation, leading to the enhancement of the overall educational process and final output. I think that today we would fly this concept under the banner of diversity. Sizer also mused about where educational pluralism might lead. He saw Catholics in the U.S. in the forefront of the movement to give institutional expression to the principle of educational pluralism, which at least in theory you still have here. His conclusion was a cautious prognostication based on socio-political realities. He says, in fact, this day may represent the darkness before the dawn for Catholics. They may be the harbingers of a pattern politically acceptable in the late 70s and 1980s. His timeline may have been just a bit too optimistic. The American public school, born of the religious conflicts and compromises of the 19th century, was charged with serving as, quote, the nation's main agency of assimilation and Americanization. Robert Lynn's observations shed much light on where parochial schools fitted and did not fit into that whole process. According to him, the controversy over government aid to such institutions was frequently rooted in anti-Catholic prejudice, but even more important, it was due to some deeply held convictions about the nature of the public. He went on to explain the nature of those convictions. In the nation with the soul of a church, the public school had taken on a sacral character, and thus the defense of public education became an exercise in political ecclesiology. This interpretation helps to explain the devout tone so evident in their protective praising of the public school, and the absoluteness with which they rejected any hints of state grants for parochial schools. By its very nature as a sectarian institution, the Catholic school was ill-equipped to pass on the public faith fully and freely expressed to the coming generation. I think you're starting to find precisely that kind of logic right now in the UK in regard to Catholic schools. I should call your attention to the expression, I believe, peculiar to the U.S., namely public schools, meant to describe what other countries more accurately classify as state or government schools. Furthermore, let me underscore the purpose of American public schools, the production of a generation thinking in accord with national goals and values, And the same can be asserted, I believe, for all state-sponsored educational institutions throughout the world. That's not necessarily a bad purpose, but one which should give freedom-loving people pause. Very simply put, it is as dangerous for governments to run schools as it is for them to run churches, since both necessarily involve the forming of men's minds and hearts. And so Samuel Blumenfeld comments, Catholics were aware enough to see where it all would lead to, and bolted the public school rather than accept the destruction of their faith. Decades earlier, then Father Fulton Sheen, in a 1938 radio address said, "We Catholics are taking religion so seriously in reference to our country that rather than see God perish out of national life," notice, not out of the church, out of national life, "we conduct 7,900 elementary schools and 1,900 high schools. And figuring on the basis of public school costs, we save the taxpayers of the country an immediate $1 billion building program, and for maintenance, $140 million every year. Every cent of this money comes out of the pockets of Catholics. And why? Because we believe that the children in Catholic elementary schools and high schools have a right to know the truth which makes them free." A right to know the truth. I used the word countercultural earlier, and I want to emphasize the importance of that concept. The best example of how a countercultural education in Catholic schools has affected the social structure of America is clearly seen in the strength and youthfulness of the pro-life movement. A few days after our National March for Life, which occurs in freezing Washington weather usually in January, a journalist in favor of, quote, abortion rights wrote an article in the Washington Post, also, of course, strongly pro-abortion. He noted that he was, quote, expecting to write about the march's irrelevance. In fact, he talked about the fact he expected to see a bunch of old ladies in tennis shoes. However, he goes on to say, "I was especially struck by the large number of young people among the tens of thousands at the march." He highlighted the fact that the vast majority came from Catholic schools who, in his words, were taught from an early age to oppose abortion. The piece ended up being remarkably fair and even positive. He said, "I want to warn my co-thinkers in the pro-abortion movement. These young people are not brainwashed, they are convinced." I maintain, without fear of contradiction, that without the Catholic schools, there would have been no serious pro-life movement in the United States. Why? Because the government schools begin their indoctrination programs in the earliest years of elementary school, and thus create a cadre of youth in their own image and likeness. The Catholic schools also pass on a value system from the earliest years, but from a gospel perspective. Anecdotally, I should observe that in my many years of teaching theology at the university level, I never encountered a female graduate of a Catholic secondary school who advanced the abortion agenda. And conversely, never encountered a female graduate of a state secondary school who was anything but virulently and vocally pro-abortion, even interrupting class lectures. A major and persistent objection to religiously oriented schools is the charge of fostering sectarianism. That's always a very, very mischievous word. We talk about faith-based schools, that's one thing. We talk about sectarian schools, that already suggests divisiveness. Objective research, however, disproves the allegation. There is absolutely no evidence of Catholic schools being divisive. On the contrary, those who attend them seem to be more supportive, for example, of racial integration and have a higher level of social consciousness than those who did not attend Catholic schools. Pope Benedict responded to this accusation and turned it around in his address to the bishops of Scotland during their 2010 ad limina visit. He was piggybacking, of course, on Obama's statement encouraging the Scots to get rid of their so-called sectarian schools. The Pope said, "You can be proud of the contribution made by Scotland's Catholic schools in overcoming sectarianism and building good relations between communities. Faith schools," he said, "are a powerful force for social cohesion, and when the occasion arises, you do well to underline this point. Catholic schools produce articulate and well-informed followers capable of taking part in the highest levels of Scottish public life." He went on, "A strong Catholic presence in the media, local and national politics, the judiciary, the professions, and the universities can only serve to enrich Scotland's national life, as people of faith bear witness to the truth, especially when that truth is called into question. He also connected Catholic schools with the much-needed effort of the bishops to combat what he called the increasing tide of secularism in Scotland. The value of a total education in a religious ambiance has become increasingly appreciated in American society, whereas that kind of a conviction was almost uniquely Catholic 50 years ago. Now it's not uncommon to hear support for this position coming from evangelicals and even Reform Jews, that is, liberal Jews. Rabbi Jacob Neusner asked, without institutions and organizations to give direction and substance to the life of such groups, what's left but inchoate sentiment? Surely this is what was meant by the assertion that Hebrew day schools are necessary, quote, for a truly meaningful Jewish community in America. And let's push a way forward then. Sometimes one hears ultra-traditional Catholics cry, before Vatican II, Catholics didn't abort or contracept or divorce. Truth be told, most mainstream Protestants didn't either. Catholics, for the most part, were not more noble than the rest of society. In fact, they're merely mirror images of the overall culture. When that culture took a nosedive, so did many Catholics. Now, let's be clear. The decline of Western civilization didn't occur overnight. It's been a long time coming. Already in 1964, James Burnham could title a book, The Suicide of the West. The suicide has its roots in the eschewing of traditional Christian mores and in the hijacking of major institutions of cultural existence by liberals, who, as it turns out, are not really all too liberal when they're opposed. And so analyses like Jonah Goldberg's Liberal Fascism, 2008, and his Tyranny of Clichés, 2012. However, solutions to the problem are also at hand, with works like Archbishop Charles Chaput's Strangers in a Strange Land, Living the Catholic Faith in a Post-Christian World, and Anthony Esselin's Out of the Ashes, Rebuilding American Culture. At the outset of this perhaps overly long discourse, I said I wanted to use the American reality as a kind of template for a much greater reality. I hope I've shown how the Church in the United States responded to an anti-Catholic threat by fashioning her own school system, and how that school system has served both the Church and the broader society very well. The secularization taking Europe by storm and menacing the U.S. to a lesser but nonetheless problematic degree can only be held off and even reversed if the Church is able to offer her members an alternative vision of life, what sociologists call a viable subculture. In essence, that's what St. Benedict did, as the decadent Roman culture was breathing its last. And that alternate vision saved not only the Church, but Western culture. The principal agent of that renewal was a monasticism which founded schools everywhere. And your country is a clear example of that. What emerged in relatively short order was the glorious Middle Ages, also called what? The Age of Faith, with the good, the true, and the beautiful, producing a superabundance of magnificent works of literature, art, music, and architecture. Believers need to be convinced, and then need to convince everyone else, that the Fathers of Vatican II got it right when they declared in Gaudium et Spes, without the Creator, the creature vanishes. And history supports that assertion. Just look at the bloodshed of every godless movement of modernity, from the French Revolution to the Mexican Revolution, the Spanish Civil War, and the murderous campaigns of the Nazis and Communists. Clearly, without the Creator, the creature vanishes. And an education devoid of God is an anti-education. Cardinal Newman saw this clearly his whole life long. As far back as 1841, he engaged the issue in the Tamworth Reading Room controversy, concluding, "But enough on this most painful portion of Sir Robert's address. As I am coming to an end, I suppose I ought to sum up in a few words what I've been saying. I consider, then, that intrinsically excellent and noble as our scientific pursuits, and worthy of a place in a liberal education, and fruitful in temporal benefits to the community, still they are not and cannot be the instrument of an ethical training. That physics do not supply a basis, but only materials for religious sentiment. That knowledge does but occupy, does not form the mind. That apprehension of the unseen is the only known principle capable of subduing moral evil, educating the multitude, and organizing society. and that whereas man is born for action, action flows not from inferences but from impressions, not from reasonings but from faith. In my country, school violence and bullying are a regular occurrence, and if I look at some of the signs around here, it seems that that's the case here as well. Similarly, we read daily of the problem of teenage suicide and clinical depression. When I was a teenager, I didn't know what the word depression meant. I thought it was a hole in the ground. Commentators shake their heads and ask why this is the case, and what can be done to remedy the situation. In the midst of these ongoing conversations, a study has surfaced coming from a rather unlikely source, namely researchers from the University of California at Santa Barbara, the left coast of our country. It's called Self-Discipline and Catholic Education. It documents in an impressive manner how, you say, quote, Catholic school children argued, fought, got angry, acted impulsively, and disturbed more ongoing activities less frequently than those in state schools and even other private institutions. Further, they were more likely to control their temper, respect others' property, accept their fellow students' ideas, and handle peer pressure. That's current. This past semester, I had to evaluate a student teacher in a so-called public school in Philadelphia. The scenario was abysmal. No discipline, no respect for teachers, foul language. In short, the atmosphere of the jungle. And this from children between the ages of 10 and 12. 2 or 3 short blocks away, there was a Catholic school, serving the exact same socioeconomic demographic, where there is order and civility, leading to genuine personal and academic growth of the pupils. While offering several reasons why there is such a discrepancy, the researchers of the just mentioned study noted, interestingly, quote, don't underestimate the power of religion to positively influence a child's behavior. And will you be surprised to learn that aside from the Wall Street Journal, I found not a single notice of this study in any of the mainstream media. Not long ago, yet another survey revealed some truly distressing data. Catholic children attending the state schools are reported to have already left the faith by the age of 10. Why? Here's the reason that's given. Those that are leaving for no religion, and a big component of them saying they're atheist or agnostic by 10. It turns out that when you probe a bit more deeply and you allow them to talk in their own words, that they are bringing up things that are related to science and a need for evidence and a need for proof, said Dr. Mark Gray, a senior research associate at the Center for Applied Research in the Apostolate at Georgetown University. On the other hand, I have witnessed Catholic school science teachers complete a lesson on fetology and then launch into a discussion on the scientific reasons behind the Church's position on abortion. Even more impressive, a science teacher who finished a unit on genetics and then provided her students with the Holy See's document Donum Vitae for class discussion. Or another science teacher having presented the scientific method to a class of freshman high school girls, so 13 or 14, then go on to explain that the scientific way is only one way of coming to the truth, that there are other ways, like the way of philosophy, the way of faith, the way of the heart. And he ended by saying, no one of these ways is sufficient, ladies. We need all of them together. And this is, by the way, from a man who's not even a Catholic. Is this being done universally in our Catholic schools? Unfortunately not. However, it is being done with increasing regularity. And the very fact that it can be done is already an important element in the overall equation. The goal of Catholic education, of course, is to make saints, which cannot be done in state-sponsored schools, and which I'm afraid will not be tolerated in the near future in the Catholic schools of the UK. The first way we make saints is by making our schools liturgical communities, not simply by offering Mass weekly or monthly, as important as that might be, but not of the strum and hum variety either. That's a topic, though, for another point. But by an overall environment of prayer and attention to what Pius Parsh called the year of grace. Saints in the making also need the finished products as models. As a boy in grammar school, I fondly remember a book we had to read called The Saints, God's Friends and Mine Too. Putting young people in touch with the Church's success stories makes sanctity doable and even exciting. Access to grace then makes possible living a holy, virtuous life, which is not simply evading the sand traps of the Ten Commandments. In this regard, I highly recommend a program created by the wonderful Dominican Sisters of Ann Arbor, Michigan. The approach is positive and communal, with the entire school community working together on development of a particular virtue for a given month. I must say it's quite charming to hear a six-year-old first grader say he's trying to develop the virtue of magnanimity. Earlier in the talk, I spoke of enabling our students to become countercultural. What does that entail? We must train our youngsters to be comfortable in their own Catholic skin, marching to the beat of a different drummer in very significant ways. Attitudes and behaviors which value the human person, understanding the meaning and beauty of sexuality, grasping the notion that being is to be appreciated over doing, which is why our Catholic schools, unabashedly Catholic schools, are more needed than ever. We need educational institutions where children are given an environment in which to grow in truly human ways, which are likewise truly Christian ways. Now, lest you think I view reality through rose-colored glasses, or just simply refuse to acknowledge gaps in Catholic schools, be sure that is not the case. Indeed, in the confused and confusing 60s and 70s, many errors were made in all too many of our schools, as they sought to mimic the state schools, resulting in a loss of parental confidence and clerical support. The one good thing about American pragmatism is that if it doesn't work, we're not afraid to get rid of it. And that has happened in Catholic education. For the past decade in particular, I've seen a strong emphasis on Catholic identity, so much so that 5 years ago, the Catholic Education Foundation, which I serve as executive director, produced a Catholic identity assessment instrument for both elementary and secondary schools. In that survey instrument, we probe every aspect of school life, including the attitudes of administrators, faculty, and support staff, resulting in a detailed report with clear indications for areas requiring development and change. Over 35 dioceses of the United States have already participated in this endeavor. Simply put, if our schools are not going to be authentically Catholic, then there's no reason for them to exist. If they are authentically Catholic, then they will serve the Church very well, but also civil society, a point Pope Benedict made when he visited us in 2008 and spoke to Catholic educators in Washington. Praising the immense sacrifices the Catholic community of America has made historically to maintain a separate school system, he observed, quote, "This sacrifice continues today. It is an outstanding apostolate of hope, seeking to address the material, intellectual, and spiritual needs of over 3 million children and students. It also provides a highly commendable opportunity for the entire Catholic community to contribute generously to the financial needs of our institutions. Their long-term sustainability must be assured. Indeed, everything possible must be done in cooperation with the wider community to ensure that they are accessible to people of all social and economic strata. No child should be denied his or her right to an education in faith, which in turn nurtures the soul of a nation." Yes, Catholic education, in his words, nurtures the soul of a nation. It's not simply something ad intra. There's an ad extra dimension to it as well. As academic standards plummet and as moral compasses collapse, the youngsters educated in our institutions will be the only viable sources of hope for the future. Now, this shouldn't inspire an arrogant triumphalism. It should, however, inspire confidence and hope. I was pleased to come across a report from the Episcopal Conference of England and Wales, which indicated that over the past 8 years, mass attendance among young Catholics has increased by 11% to 49%, while the percentage of those professing atheism or agnosticism declined by 7%. Here there's cause for rejoicing, huh? Admittedly, this cohort is a very small part of the overall picture of life in the UK. However, this suggests that things are moving in the right direction. Further, smaller is often better, as the former Cardinal Ratzinger often suggested. He seemed to change his position when he changed his name to Benedict. Cultural Catholics are not helpful to the cause, because not infrequently they impede the forward push of John Paul's new evangelization. Engaging these young British Catholics, particularly in the work of Catholic education, would seem to recommend itself at first blush. Convinced believers form other convinced believers. Let me conclude with some very insightful observations of the convert, monk, and poet of the 20th century, Thomas Merton. Reflecting on some of his boyhood spent in France between the two world wars, he contrasted a state school in the village with a Catholic one. He wrote, now remember, this is in the 1930s. When I think of the Catholic parents who sent their children to a school like that, meaning the state school, I begin to wonder what was wrong with their heads. Down by the river in a big clean white building was a college run by the Marist fathers. I had never seen inside it. Indeed, it was so clean it frightened me. But I knew a couple of boys who went to it. They were the sons of the little lady who ran the pastry shop opposite the church of Saint Antonin. And I remember them as exceptionally nice fellows, very pleasant and good. It never occurred to anyone to despise them for being pious, and how unlike the products of the state school they were. When I reflect on all this, I am overwhelmed at the thought of the tremendous weight of moral responsibility that Catholic parents accumulate upon their shoulders by not sending their children to Catholic schools. Those who are not of the Church have no understanding of this. They cannot be expected to. As far as they can see, all this insistence on Catholic schools is only a money-making device by which the Church is trying to increase its domination over the minds of men and its own temporal prosperity. And of course, most non-Catholics imagine that the Church is immensely rich, and that all Catholic institutions make money hand over fist, and that all that money is stored away somewhere to buy gold and silver dishes for the Pope and cigars for the College of Cardinals. Well, Dolan is one of those. Is it any wonder that there can be no peace in a world where everything possible is being done to guarantee that the youth of every nation will grow up absolutely without moral and religious discipline and without the shadow of an interior life or of that spirituality and charity and faith which alone can safeguard the treaties and agreements made by governments? And Catholics, thousands of Catholics everywhere, have the consummate audacity to weep and complain because God does not hear their prayers for peace when they have neglected not only his will, but the ordinary dictates of natural reason and prudence, and let their children grow up according to the standards of a civilization of hyenas. I would encourage you and beg you not to allow a generation to grow up according to the standards of a civilization of hyenas.
We hope you enjoyed the program and will join us back for another show on WCAT Radio. This is Sebastian Mahfood. Good day.